To be successful, you got to know yourself. Knowing yourself gives you confidence to sell your ideas. You might have a good idea and not know yourself. That's a bad combination. Your identity, who you are, that's very important. Not that the idea is going to work, but it's foundational in how you apply that to selling your idea. You need to set yourself up for growth from the beginning. Really know the values that you care about. Write them down, preach them, repeat them, live them, and those values help you build a strong organization.
Welcome to another episode of Unlock Your Potential, where we get to have amazing conversations with amazing human beings in our ongoing quest to find that ineffable singularity that determines success and can predict it for any one of us. Today, we are joined by Jason Harris, co-founder and CEO of the award-winning creative advertising agency Mekanism, also author of the national best-selling book, The Soulful Art of Persuasion. Some of his advertising methods have actually been studied as case studies at Harvard Business School, and you can learn more about him at thesoulfulart.com. I was really pleased with the conversation that I had with Jason. I went into it knowing that we were both, had experience in marketing. We were both sort of, had some professional overlap and some stuff in common, but I really did not know how much I was going to find myself delighting in really deep alignment over some concepts that you'll obviously hear us explore in the conversation, but particularly how entrepreneurship itself can be a forge for a person to discover what they're capable of and to continually challenge themselves to improve and up level. I'm confident you're going to find a lot of wonder in this conversation, and I invite you to enjoy my conversation with Jason Harris. So, Jason, if you could kind of start us at the beginning, where are you from? What's your backstory, and how did you end up doing what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Virginia, outside of DC. Both of my parents were professors, so they were in the academic world. And I always learned, I was a musician for a while too. I know you were as well. But I always learned from kind of doing, and my parents were avid readers and teachers. And I always learned from like going out and experience things and being in the mix. And that's the way that I learned versus, putting my nose in a book, even though we're talking about a book that I wrote. And I kind of always loved entertainment, and I always loved branding. And I really learned a lot about branding from the band Kiss. And the band Kiss really kind of sparked with me the power that branding has, because I joined the Kiss Army as a kid. I collected all their merchandise. I bought all their albums. I loved the backstory of the Demon and the Star Child. And I just, was really into that band. And somewhere in my consciousness, I realized that was like storytelling and branding. And so kind of Kiss led me into the advertising world, because I loved the idea of like the power of building a brand. And so I went to school to make my parents happy and, got an econ degree. And then I wanted to go into the advertising world and learn about marketing and branding. And so I worked at a bunch of different places, but I always had that, maybe like a lot of your listeners, I always had that entrepreneurial gene inside me. I knew I wanted to start my own thing, but the way I went about it was knowing that I wanted to start an agency. So that was like the end goal. The way I was going to do that was to work at other places. And when I worked at all these places, I would take notes of like the culture and the values and what manager I liked and what manager I didn't like. And sort of that became, when we started the agency Mekanism about 17 years ago, I really looked at that as a playbook of the kind of company I wanted to start based on what I liked and didn't like at places that I had worked. And that experience was really invaluable to me versus just starting something right off the bat. I wanted to get that experience and learning the business and the trade before I started something. And then I started the agency with 3 other friends of mine. And we've been doing it ever since.
17 years.
Yeah, 17 years.
With Mekanism. Obviously, it's an award-winning agency. It's done extremely well. You've been recognized both, as a creative advertising innovator, but also as a CEO and business leader in that agency. Congratulations on all your success.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
That's incredible. And the agency business is a tough business. I had one for almost 6 years, and I sold it. And to be honest, when I sold it, I felt like, man, I barely made it out. I made it out alive. I mean, it's a tough business.
Where was your agency? Was it in?
It was here in St. George. So
Okay.
Admittedly, a very different, this is not a big, really dynamic local business market, although it's certainly, even in the last few years, it's changed and grown a lot. But I was having to do all of my customer acquisition through outbound phone sales. Nobody ever came into my office to sit down and have a client meeting.
Yeah.
So maybe a little different dynamic than you being in, I assume your agency is based where you are in Manhattan.
Yeah, we started actually in San Francisco, and then I moved to Manhattan about 10 years ago. And we now have New York office, San Francisco, Seattle,
okay,
and Chicago. So we kind of expanded in the US, but the agents, I mean, any business is hard, right? Like starting any business is, you're doing the invoicing and the pitching and the, client management, and you're kind of doing all aspects of it. But, it kind of takes I don't know, probably took us about 4 years before we really got things rolling. And, a lot of it was just perseverance and sticking with it, and knowing it was going to be lean when we started, and just kind of building it brick by brick. But it was a long journey, to kind of to get to where we are. And I actually sold the business in June. We were been independent for the whole time, but we sold it in June in order really to, we got it to about 50 million in revenue, and we wanted to get it to 100 million. And I didn't want to wait another 17 years to double it. So I wanted to get some strategic partnership, but still stay on and run it. So that was our plan. But yeah, the service business, the advertising business, it's super hyper competitive. The money can be good, the clients can be good, but you really, have to have thick skin and just kind of keep going.
Mm-hmm. It's a very what have you done for me lately business. You don't get a lot of credit for what you did last year.
No, you've got to build the brands that you're working on. You have to kind of do two things. You got to build the brands into really dynamic, powerful brands. And then at the same time, you have long-term goals with your brand partners. And then short-term goals, you got to convert sales and drive revenue and keep their shareholders happy. So you're kind of doing all those things at the same time, short-term, long-term. First of all, I know that a large percentage of the audience is either building a business or in the early stage of building a business. We talked about this earlier, kind of the audience mix, right? A lot of people that are kind of kicking off their business growth endeavors. Some people have more mature businesses. They're really trying to grow it. So I'm excited to, dig in a little more to lessons learned and, again, tactical, applicable stuff from scaling to a $50 million, revenue rate. That's pretty rarefied air for an independent agency. Yeah, we got pretty lucky and got to a nice size.
What do you attribute that to? What is it that you guys do better than most?
Well, our positioning is soul and science, and it's really about creative plus performance. And so one thing we do as a company is we always look at where the market's going, and we always pivot the company and evolve the company. And, you hear that in business all the time, evolve or die. We always hear that analogy that we always use, like if a shark stops swimming, it's right. Dead. And so you always got to be swimming like a shark and figuring out what's next. And so when we started the agency, we did a lot of digital production. So digital was kind of nascent and new at the time. And that was our point of difference. Then viral marketing was big. So we did a lot of viral marketing. Then we added on services and became a full service agency. And then in the past couple of years, we added on performance, because everything now is performance based, and you have to measure all your activity in the market so you can show data on how you're doing and how your conversion's going. Are you getting, driving clicks to their website? Are you getting customers to purchase? And so we're evolving now to do full funnel services, which is offering everything from, CRM to one-to-one to loyalty, while we're also, we built the business on being kind of top of the funnel strategy and creative and brand as a business. And so that's just one thing that's been really successful for us, is we always look to our clients to see what they need from us. And then we add those services and change along with what our clients' needs are, versus becoming successful and then stopping, or saying, this formula works, so why would we change it? We're always evolving every couple of years.
How many employees or total kind of essential headcount, whether they're employees or contractors or, key strategic vendors, like how many people does it take to make the Mekanism ecosystem run?
We have about 200 full-time employees, and then we have freelancers and partners.
So you're about the same size as Entre. We have, I think, just under 200 full-time headcount. And so I'm asking, out of a lot of self-interest, not just, for the audience's benefit. You said it took 4 years when you started to kind of get some, call it traction, right? And you said figure it out. And that was you, and you said 3 friends? Yeah.
So I had started a business prior, and it was me. And then I had a partner who was based in another city. And I was kind of doing, 5 jobs. And that first year I burned out. Like, I absolutely hated it. Even though we were doing okay, my whole waking hour was, every hour was put into the business, and I was doing everything. And I got really crispy on that. And when I synced up with some friends to do it, together, and we had different skills as we came together, to me, that was the magic, because having other people to bounce things off of, not being a solopreneur, which some people love, it wasn't for me. I had to have partners to be a successful entrepreneur, because it was just too much anxiety for me to do it by myself. And there's too many things I didn't know, and too many blind spots I had. So when we came together, we really, found something special. But the magic that helped us become successful is we sort of had a plan and some insights. My business is different than probably a lot of people that are listening, and different than your business. But our plan was, we started with, we have 7 values that we still have today. We kept those values. Those values are a filter for future hires, for people that we have, for really the way the company was going to build its culture. And we haven't really deviated from those values. So that was one thing that was really important. And then the other is, we wanted to get big name clients. So we work with, today, Charles Schwab, Alaska Airlines, Jose Cuervo, Fanatics, big brands, like really name brands. And that was our strategy. And so when we started, we would do some lesser known brands that would come to us because we were inexpensive and we were small. And we would then pitch big brands ideas that we would, cold call and go in and pitch them ideas. And if they like the idea, we say, okay, we'll make the idea for you. And then if you like it, you can run it. And maybe you can cover our costs if you like it. And the magic of that was getting famous brands and clients on our roster. And then that would beget bigger clients and well-known brands that would then pay us. And so we kind of did, basically, I call it like, free work to get the logos. Yeah. And when we got the logos, then we got more credibility, and then we got, into bigger pitches and bigger brands. And that was part of our strategy. So the first few years were just, lean and, not paying ourselves and sometimes paying ourselves, but we didn't have staff to really worry about at the time. And that was our strategy. And it took a while, but then it started to build momentum once we got, some famous brands that we did some work on.
So you sort of naturally answered what was going to be my follow-up question based on, the early days and the success that you've had since. And that was going to be, what is it that you feel like you did a good job of installing into the company in its early days that became a very stable foundation upon which you could grow without, cracking under the weight of growth. Yeah. And you kind of answered it. You said it's these values, that you really were a very value-centric company. I think a lot of lip service gets paid to, mission and vision and values. And I have found that especially for non-venture backed, well-funded startups, companies that have to grow by virtue of making a legitimate mark and people being interested in wanting to pay attention, not just because they can brute force their way into the market with a big advertising budget that's, paid for by investors, that you have to be sincere about values and what you stand for. Yeah. And it seems like that ties in with your, soul plus science. I mean, essentially what we're talking about is the soul. So can you talk a little bit more maybe how about, sure, when it's you and three partners that are, founders, co-founders, like, yeah, you can all be on the same page and that has a nice, casual feel to it. But like, as you started to scale, how did you make sure, like, what was your people strategy to make sure that like we're bringing on people that are really aligned and we're holding people accountable over time to really be expressing these values through the work that they're doing here? Yeah.
So it was very, particular. And the people that work here, we call them creative entrepreneurs. And that is the sort of framework of the people that we look to hire. And so some of those values, I'll just rattle them off, but optimistic, realistic, fearless, weird, collaborative, and entrepreneurial. And so those are the values that we really instilled. And that is who we look to hire. We look to hire these creative entrepreneurs. And we actually judge today, our performance reviews are based on these values, like how well the people at the company uphold these values. And we put them in our creds materials when we meet with any client. We talk about them at every company meeting. Like, people are probably so sick of these values by now, but they can recite them. Yeah. And they know what they are. And it's a real good filter for not just the people we hire, but the clients we want to take on, because they know what our DNA is and what we expect. And we expect when people are working here, they're going to be super collaborative internally. They're going to be super collaborative with our clients. We want them to be weird, which is really bring your full self to the office. We want all your personality. We want your opinion. We don't want you to conform. We don't want your, real personality out in the world and then your work personality here at the office. And so, that's an important one. And then optimistic is just, we expect people to, try to find the opportunities and approach every challenge with a positive outlook and what we can accomplish. And so, when we see hires that we've made that are really eye people or egocentric or want to step on someone else to move up the organization, we cut them out. And we're very clear. We're very transparent. This is what we expect. This is the culture we're building. This is how we're going to act. And we need you to if this suits you, it's the right culture for you. This is our expectation. And I think a lot of companies skip that step. They think culture will just sort of magically happen, or that there'll be such an inspirational leader that, culture will carry through the organization. But you need to set yourself up for growth from the beginning, really know the values that you care about and that your clients will care about, and write them down, preach them, repeat them, live them. And those values help you build a strong organization. But a lot of people skip that step and either don't write them down or maybe get too esoteric about them. And I think that was really an important thing in our success, to do that at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that. I think the book, I've read so many books in the last couple of years, specifically around business leadership and growth, because we've been scaling my business, and I'm like, I need to get better at this, right? So I probably read 100 books in the last 3 years about scaling businesses. So
what was the best one you've read?
I'm trying to remember what it was. Well, the one that's coming to mind right now, because I think that it's the source of what I'm about to say, is called Less is More by Jason Jennings. But best one I've read, there's one I'm actually listening to right now that is called Outsiders. I mean, I listen to a lot of stuff and I tend to apply it a lot to business, but Outsiders is actually a study of 8 different great CEOs that wildly outperformed their industry and their category, and especially did so over time spans that were long enough that, like, they weren't just bull markets, Right.
They didn't just come in the sweet times. They had to
fantastic book. A lot of really, like, sort of value centrism, just how to play the long game and really, really create value and focus on, intelligent allocation of capital over time, and just basically how to do business right and not be sort of short-term, short-sighted. But anyways, the book I'm thinking of right now, Less is More, one of the things it said is that as a CEO, that you're doing your job when people basically roll their eyes every time you talk, because you're such a broken record about the mission and the values and the heartbeat and the soul and the message and, like, all this stuff that everybody's like, okay, Jason, we got it already, man. But, like, human beings by nature and by environment, we drift. It's just what happens. We lose focus, and the CEO's the constant North Star reorienter to the singularity of what is true for an organization. And it's an endless, to some degree, thankless job that will never really fully be appreciated, but you are doomed without somewhere between doomed or at least pay a massive opportunity cost if you don't do it consistently, persistently, and obsessively. So
absolutely. I love that. I'm going to have to read that book too. Less is More.
Yeah, it's really good.
Who wrote it?
Did you say? Jennings.
Okay.
Yeah, I read it a couple of years ago. We had a year where we scaled, like, because we just kind of hit a vein and we're purely digital. So we have relatively frictionless scale, at least to a point. And we scaled like 4,000% in 12 months.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
And I was like reading everything I get my hands on around, like, managing growth. And anyways, it's kind of an intense period. I can say from hindsight that some people may think that sounds amazing. Like, oh, I'd love to be 40 times bigger a year from now than I am now. I promise you, like, it was not super healthy. It's like, it'd be like having a 5-year-old that was like 6'6". And they're like, there's a lot of filling out that needs to happen.
Right? I love that. That's great.
Anyway, so, okay. I appreciate, I mean, I can say I'm going to go ahead and attribute that a lot of your success over 17 years stems from this sort of obsessive installation of these values in the earliest days. I assume you'd agree with that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, that's why that's sort of like one of 3 things that I think really helped us weather the business world and downturns and come out on the other side of it.
What are the other 2 then? You probably knew.
Yeah. The other one, which I mentioned, was on building the business was for us was proactively going after who we wanted to work with, and not just work that would come or work that was low hanging fruit, but really dead set on we need to get in this field of brands for our business to really explode. And then the third was constantly evolving the business. I mean, and there's people that have been at the company for, early days, like 12 years, 13 years, that are in leadership positions at the company. And, you get everyone aligned to constant change. And I don't mean constant change, but like 3 or 4 years, you're changing your business model to the market and never being satisfied with where you're at. And that, I think that's the other thing that really made a difference is thinking, you have to decipher like what's real that's happening around me and in the marketing world or in the business world, and what are we going to change and add? Are we going to start thinking about NFTs? Are we going to start thinking about the metaverse? Are we going to start thinking about whatever the new thing is, because there's always something changing? What do we think is here to stay, and how are we going to orient the business around that? And so that practice has proven to be really valuable in order for us to, not become a dinosaur and to have longevity.
So when and why did you write your book?
So I wrote my book a couple of years ago. It came out, and it took me 3 years to write. So as I was
only 3, mine took like 4 or 5, depending how you quantify it.
I mean, I thought 3 was a long time, but you're running a business and then your side hustle's, writing a book. And I would, it really came from a lot of what we've been talking about, but it was a lot of personal experience as an entrepreneur. And it's a bit of a entrepreneur guidebook. It's like how to win friends and influence people, but kind of a modern version of that. What I found to be successful for anyone in the business world, and it's also about character building. So it can be a personal book as well. But I really felt that personally, I had 4 principles that I found to create a successful business. And that's different than company values, because those company values would change when you started another different company. You would have different values because it's based on that entity. But there's 4 principles that I think are enduring for any business, for any leader, and then, their character building personally as well. And so I found these principles for me helped me become, successful in the business world. And that's sort of, I felt like I had something to offer in writing a book. Because as you know, books are a ton of work. You're not getting rich writing a book unless you're, Barack Obama or, someone.
Unless you're already rich and people want to read about it.
Yeah, unless you get, $1 million book deals and they you're a celebrity or whatever. But for the rest of us, it's very hard to think about it as a business proposition. I thought about it much more as it was something I wanted to accomplish, but I also felt like I had a lot of learning that I could give to people that are, in the business world, or working on how do they become more persuasive? How do they become more successful? And so I felt like I had something to specific point of view.
Yeah, I feel like a book. I can say for me, it's been a great business card. It's been a great door opener. There's some credibility that you would say that comes from it. But I think the thing that I liked the most about writing a book, and I'm curious how you relate to this experience, is that it forced me to deal with myself.
Yeah.
And deal, to really truly get over any sort of lingering imposter syndrome, and also to really decide what my standards are. I mean, here's what I decided. Even writing a bad book would be a lot of work. But writing a good book would be a lot more work still. And within that range,
Yeah.
how good a book am I willing to do the work to write? What is my true standard? Because a book is going to literally outlive. It's like the one thing that we create as workers or creators or doers that's actually going to outlive us, other than our business itself, maybe. But most businesses probably don't, live 100 years, but
Right.
a book does, right? And so I'm curious. For me, it was a forge in which to sharpen myself, and I'm curious.
So your book just came out recently, right?
August. So about 4 months.
And so your book also matches, it's the name of the podcast, right?
It is Unlock Your Potential. Yeah. You got a picture on the wall right there.
Yeah. So it's sort of the same as the podcast and the same as what you're offering in your company, right? So it's kind of, it's all one, would you say?
Yeah,
or?
I'd say to some degree, it's certain. Yeah, I would say it's a business card of my personal brand, that I exist in this world to help people unlock their potential in a way that's distinct from, let's call it, the personal development or professional development industry, for that matter, where it's like, here's some more stuff to do. Here's some hard work to grind on to level yourself up. I'm really seeking frameworks and heuristics and things that people can orient around that actually make life easier. Yeah. And make it easier to get better and unlock your potential in the process. And I feel this conversation going in a really exciting direction that I'm grateful for, because I feel like we're very aligned. And when I hear you talk about your book and even your belief set that underpins your book and your business, I hear a lot of alignment, which is that entrepreneurship, or what I call entrepreneurialism, which is the being as opposed to the doing of entrepreneurship, is a wonderful mechanism, no pun intended, for developing ourselves as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I think a lot of people have kind of reductively categorized entrepreneurship as purely like a financial or economic strategy. Like, I can have a different financial outcome, or I can increase the value of my time, or I can become more prominent or more authoritative. Like, there's a lot of, like you said, kind of I-centric reasons for doing it. But I have found it to be the forge in which you can develop yourself to be of the greatest value and impact for the world at large. And that's what I'm so passionate about it. And I believe entrepreneurship is a great crucible in which to unlock your potential. It's kind of how it all comes together. I get the sense you're aligned there.
Absolutely. I love that. I love the use of crucible too.
And I feel like in your book, you said that there's 4 values that transcends any business case.
Yeah, definitely.
Every new company will have new company values, but these 4 values are really about the entrepreneur, not the business.
That's right. They're about.
Can you share? Can we dig into them? Because obviously they were important enough to you that you wrote a book about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're character building habits that are essential to personal growth, but also business success. So it is about the individual for sure. And I think these principles, and like you were describing in your book, I wanted to talk about these principles, but then have specific habits you can practice to make sure you're kind of living these principles. So it's not just like, here are the principles, good luck. It's right. Like, here are the principles, and here's the way you can develop these characteristics. And so that was the idea.
So what are the 4? We probably won't have time to talk through them all in depth, but I'd love to.
Yeah, I can give you like a top line. But the first principle is called original, and that is, from the Oscar Wilde quote, "Be yourself, everyone else is already taken." It's really about wearing your personal idiosyncrasies on your sleeve. It's about understanding who your role models are. It's understanding your core values, but it's really understanding who you are, and that is like the building blocks of everything. And part of that is learning to be a great storyteller, to connect with your audience. or to whoever you're trying to connect with, and transporting people through storytelling. And storytelling can take many different forms and shapes, but that's sort of the foundational principle. And I think a lot of people don't take the time to understand what makes them special and unique. And I'm sure in Unlock Your Potential, you talk a lot about that, but that is foundational. And then the second one is the principle 2 is generous, which is really cultivating generous characteristic and personality. And I think one thing I always think about in that one is trying to give something away in every interaction. So whenever you're cross paths with someone, leave the person a little bit better off than they were before they crossed paths with you. And so, of course, this is not always going to happen, but it's a mindset of trying to lay the groundwork for becoming generous and becoming positive and showing respect. Third principle is empathetic, and that's really developing a natural curiosity about other people and listening more than you're judging and seeking to understand, seeking out collaborations, looking for commonalities, not differences. And that's principle 3. And then the fourth one is soulful, which is about living a skillful life, hunting out new skills, developing passions, creating a life defined by proficiency. And the other part of that is being inspirational, trying to do something bigger than yourself to help, make the world a little bit better. And so those 4 principles together are, original, leaning into your own authenticity and honesty about who you are, generous, being habitual about giving and not expecting things in return, empathetic, developing a natural curiosity about engaging others, and then soulful is really, holding yourself to these standards of always learning and trying to inspire. And those 4 are the real cornerstones of becoming a more persuasive, soulfully persuasive person.
So I have to show you, you started with original and you mentioned the Oscar Wilde quote. This is the very last page of my book, Unlock Your Potential. If you're not on video, just take my word for it. And at the very end of the book, can you see the quote that I ended with?
Oh my God, no way.
Be yourself. Everyone else is taken. Oscar Wilde.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's all right.
You also talked, I'm hearing so much.
That's the end of your book. And that's the first thing in my book.
That's crazy.
Which is so crazy. Cool. I know.
Yeah, that really is. Well, but here's the thing. It's actually not crazy because it is a deep truth of modern entrepreneurship. Now, to be clear, 100 years ago, that was perhaps not the formula for successful entrepreneurship. I don't think, I say that. I mean, I guess one could argue Nikola Tesla, for example, would have been a more successful entrepreneur if he had been a little less himself, because he was so idiosyncratic that he basically got disdained at the time. And Thomas Edison beat him in part just by playing the game a little better and being a little less quirky, right? So like the world has
be more political.
Yeah, and I think this is a wonderful evolution, is that we actually live in a world now where weirdness, I love that you locked on that term weird, which comes from the old English weird, which means the ability to foretell and create a different destiny or a different future. They used to burn people at the stake who were weird because they thought that they controlled the future. But isn't that what everybody wants now, is to create a different future for themselves? Like, so we live in a world now where being weird and being idiosyncratic and being original is an asset. It's a strength. And you talk in your book about David Bowie, hearkening to your musician origins, doesn't get much weirder than that. And the guy, to your point, literally without David Bowie, there's no U2, you said. There's no Lady Gaga. I mean, this is trailblazing innovation and really brilliant entrepreneurship.
So my David Bowie story that I do talk about in the book, which David Bowie also for me was, when I talk about being original, this is why I think role models are so important. is I was a big David Bowie fan. I still am, but he was so weird and so quirky and always changed characters and, did his own thing. And that's what made him popular, because he was so unique and stood out. And when he started his career, his first album, which I actually have behind me, which is very hard to find, he got a record label and they wanted him to sound just like Bob Dylan and play folk music because that's what was popular at the time. And so it's not a good album. It's copycat music. The album did not do well. Like it failed. And he fired his label and then went away on a sort of sojourn to discover himself, and went to a Buddhist monastery. He experimented with different art forms. He studied dance. He did all kinds of things to really get to know himself. And then when he came back as the David Bowie we know today and started lighting the music world on fire, because his music came from his heart and it came from who he really was. And that's when he took off. And that juxtaposition is just so clear as a metaphor for anyone who is thinking about their business or their hustle or whatever they want to create. By leaning into his traits and who he was and his authenticity, that's what the world found interesting. And it wasn't, oh, we need another Bob Dylan. It's that we needed a David Bowie.
This was the album that had, Space Oddity.
Yeah.
Which is like one of my all-time favorite songs. And it's weird. It's out there.
It's out there, man.
And you think about, contemporaries, Pink Floyd, stuff is weird, man. And I think that, so I'm curious, when you work with young.
I love that you're calling out Space Oddity. It's such a good.
Oh, it's so good.
Such a departure from his self-titled album, but yeah, it's really, really out there.
It's you have to take a chance. I interviewed somebody yesterday here on the show, brilliant guy, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, this almost caricaturesque, English professor type. He's got the beard, the white beard, and he lives on Isle of Skye, Scotland. And he, lives this very bucolic, isolated life where he writes these 800-page books that are transcendently amazing and academically rigorous. And anyway, but he was talking about how society has developed a pathological risk aversion. And the reality is, and he was saying, it's so silly because we're all playing the same game and it always ends in death. And the notion of being risk averse is to say, let me simply make the time before I ultimately fail at life, i.e. die. Let me also make it dull and intolerable that is to be risk averse. He's like, it's so silly to be so freaking risk averse. And the reality is that the most intrinsically risky thing on this earth is simply to be ourselves in it.
I love that.
And that people are so terrified. Imagine if David Bowie had been deep inside, I feel this flamboyant, bizarre, quasi-alien-esque persona, and it just wants to get out. But I'm so scared they might not like me. Let me not take the risk. And then he would have just sucked the rest of his life. And that's what most people do.
Yes. I love that.
So how do I'm curious.
I always love this also. It made me think of it. In the NFL, I don't know if you're a football fan, but 4th and 1 conversion rate for those that try it is 70%.
Really? I love knowing that. I didn't know that.
And so if you think of how often you punt on a 4th and 1 because you're scared of making a mistake, or making the wrong call.
And it's really the coach. The coach is scared of getting eviscerated in the media or fired. That's really what they're afraid of. They're not afraid of the outcome because, like you said, the outcome's probably good.
The outcome's very high. But I don't know. I wish I should have the accompanying stat of how many times they go for 4th and 1. But I know from watching football, it's not as frequent as it should be. And so I love that. It's like I love what was the guy's name in Isle of Skye?
The Dr. Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, Ian McGilchrist. I love that because he's 100% right. Risk taking is a lot less risky than it sounds, because being risk averse is riskier than leaning into risk, because to stand out and be successful, you have to be risky or you're going to just become wallpaper. And that's the David Bowie principle.
So I Googled it while you were talking.
Okay.
NFL teams go for it on 4th and 1 about 20% of the time.
There you go.
And there are certain coaches like, and it mentions Bill Belichick, who has developed a reputation and I'm reading this article on Bleacher Report here, like I said, that I just pulled up while you were talking. And it talks about Bill Belichick having a reputation as a maverick, as a gambler, it's using this language, who tosses caution to the wind and goes for it on 4th down more often than his coaching colleagues. He still only goes for it less than 50% of the time, but it's more than twice as much as the average. And you're thinking, yeah, but that's because he's Bill Belichick. It's not because although he is perhaps a brilliantly strategic coach, but he's not going for it more on 4th and 1 because he's a brilliantly strategic coach who quantitatively sees things that other coaches don't see. He does it because he's freaking Bill Belichick, and he knows that he's less likely to be, criticized or fired. Bob Kraft isn't going to fire Bill Belichick because he blew it on a 4th and 1 call. It's his willingness to just be himself that makes him look weird, but it's actually just him doing the logical thing. And other coaches, it's not because they're not as smart as him, it's because they're not as secure as him.
That's right. I love that. That's a great analogy.
And so, you can hear I'm getting like fired up talking about this because I'm in the entrepreneurial development business. I help people. My book is called The Ultimate Guide for Creating Your Dream Life in the Modern World, because my point is there is a life out there that virtually anyone can go get if they'll just be themselves and be bold enough to go get it. That's like right. The modern world, there's so much opportunity. And yet most people are too indoctrinated into one path to go get it. And
I think it's easy to go get it. It's easier to go get it because the majority of the world won't.
Right.
That's why it opens up. And that's why, Bill Belichick does he look like a genius because he goes for 4th and 1 and successfully completes it? Or does he look like a genius because he's doing the smart thing? Is he right. Bill Belichick and then he can go for 4th and 1? Or does he become Bill Belichick because he makes these calls that appear risky, but they have a 30% chance of not making it, 70% chance of making it? He's going to have a better chance of making it than not. Same thing with like the world out there. It's easier for people that will take risks because so many people won't. So opens it up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I talk a lot about the difference between math-made odds and man-made odds. Like, yes, mathematically, certain things may be statistically improbable or risky or whatnot, but that's just the math. The reality is, if you're willing to consistently get up and rigorously apply yourself in your soulfulness, for example, in that category, you talk about skill hunting and how when people are recognized as being, superlatively skilled at a thing, then it gives them gravitas across many other things too, right? This is why celebrity, let's say actors weighing in on political opinions actually can sway votes, because even though they're completely unqualified to talk about politics, the simple fact that that they're skilled at one thing gives them authority in another thing, right? And so
that's why Herschel Walker can almost win in Georgia, because he's Herschel Walker. You're like, well, this guy is proficient. He was a great football player. Anything he puts his mind to, he can be great at. So
certain things about him because he was great at one thing. And what do you know about him? He's consistent. He's hardworking. He's disciplined. He's got a certain amount of self-mastery.
That's right.
And so my point is the distinction between math-made odds and man-made odds is that simply by developing, to your point, character traits and embodying them over time, you distinguish yourself from the math. The math becomes irrelevant because, like you said, 95% of people, they're not even playing the same game as you once you've done something consistently and daily for 10 years.
That's right. And the math will be in your favor. I mean, if you wanted to crunch numbers and do the data, the math's going to be in your favor. And so the math even is going to tell you it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Once you embody good character traits over time, the math swings in your favor.
And once you are proficient at those skills, you have to have that expertise and learn that expertise. I have a question for you that I always wrestle with.
Okay.
I think this conversation's super interesting. What happens when because sometimes people go for it and they're risky and maybe they learn the skill and they're, hustling, they're hardworking, they're not lazy, they're putting their time and energy into it, but they have an idea that is just not a good idea. Like they launch something that just isn't sticking. It's just not a good idea, no matter what they put behind it, how badly they want it, how much risk they have put into it. Some ideas just don't work. Some combination of talent just might not work. Some things just don't happen. How do you advise people when that's the case? What would you say in a situation like that?
Yeah, I would say, you mentioned empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy, I think empathy strongly correlates to growth. In psychology, they talk about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And to me, it's the ability to really receive feedback from your environment. And ask the deeper question of why am I in business? Why am I attached to this idea, right? If I'm attached to an idea that is not landing and not working, and I am getting feedback to that effect, then one could argue that there is a great amount of ego in trying to insist that it's a good idea and that the rest of the world is wrong and they just need to get it.
Yeah.
Right? If you're getting feedback from people, and there's a fine line, right, between to try to understand why isn't this working, and I'll use myself as an example because now that I've said that, I have to sort of place myself under the same analysis that I'm out there saying to the world, there is an opportunity for a life less ordinary, a different level of fulfillment than maybe the more traditional path. If you're going to open yourself up to some risk, you're going to learn some of the right skills, and you're going to embrace the more entrepreneurial way of being in the world, right? I get many, many people that resist or reject that message. And frankly, when I started almost 4.5 years ago, almost everybody resisted that message and they just rejected me because it's like, who is this knucklehead that just appeared in my feed with some self-declared authority and he's annoying, right? And that's like the hater thing. Human nature will bully you if they perceive you as weak or small. That's just human nature, right? Yeah. And so when you start out with a thing, I think there is an important ability to parse, am I getting rejected because I'm perceived as small? And by the way, if you're small and unproven, you have to understand the risk that you are asking someone else to take just by agreeing or aligning with you.
That's right.
And recognize that sometimes their rejection of you could just be their own risk aversion, not necessarily because it's a bad idea.
Yep.
Right. So I think that's the first critical lens you have to develop some perspective on. But then if you've done it consistently enough and you've been steady enough and people have recognized in you that I know that you've read Cialdini because you reference it in your book, that commitment and consistency principle that like, hey, this person is steadfast in what they're saying and I still reject their idea. Once you start getting that feedback, I think you have to be humble enough to say, if my aim is to serve people and this idea isn't serving them, then like it becomes a question of ego to persist.
I love that. I think you answered it very succinctly. Because I think if they're not willing to give you a shot in whatever business you're doing, it's incumbent on you to do kind of two things. One, how do you lower the risk for them? So it's less risky.
Which you guys did in your early days by giving it away.
Which is how we started.
Yeah.
Which is like, yeah, it's going to be risky for you to work with an unknown entity. I'm going to take that risk out and we're going to prove ourselves. And if it's successful, you'll run that work and then you'll probably hire us for more work. And that's how we lowered the risk. So lowering the risk for the other party and then listening to the feedback. So if we lowered the risk, then we went back with an idea and it was garbage, listening to the feedback of why it was garbage. And so we can take that in and change versus, I lowered the risk. I know this is a great idea. They just didn't like it, which also happens. But if you're hearing that feedback consistently, you have to listen to that feedback. That's part of the empathetic principle. And then the other thing is, which we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, is always changing. So if you're hearing that feedback and you're hearing from your audience or your consumer, your client, what their needs are, you are going to be strong enough, not let your ego get in their way, but be strong enough to mold and change your idea to the market conditions you're seeing so that you're offering something that is relevant to who you're selling to. And so I think adapting, thinking about how you lower the risk, how do you listen to the feedback, and how do you evolve? Those are all traits of, if you have a good idea, making it a long-lasting idea. Like how do you make it sticky? And so that, I think I think we would have gone out of business probably 4 times if we weren't evolving.
Yeah. Well, that's true of every successful entrepreneur with longevity. I have to imagine. It's certainly been true for me.
Yeah.
It's, by the way, sometimes I do go out of business and then I rebirth. I mean, I had an agency. I guess I sold my agency. That was fine. But I mean, prior to that, or actually during that, I had a direct sales offer that I created online that in a year, it grew to about $1 million a month. And in another year, it fell off 95%. And
wow.
Literally went from $1 million a month to $50,000 a month. And by the way, about a $200,000 a month burn rate. So at $50,000 a month in revenue and $200,000 a month in burn, that was a pretty scary equation. But like, that doesn't mean I'm a failure.
No,
from the ashes of that, what my entrepreneurial education platform was born. But like, so this actually goes to the next question that I want to ask you. And by the way, do you have time for one more question? I think we're technically over time, but
yeah, I do.
I appreciate that. Underneath this cycle of feedback and adaptation, or even outright death and rebirth, like whatever, underneath it, there has to be a foundational confidence in oneself that, first of all, my idea is not my identity. If the idea doesn't work, it doesn't mean that I'm a failure, or that I'm fundamentally flawed and incapable of success. But so I'll use in your case.
But those thoughts will run through your mind.
They will. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so in your case, you're going to taking the risk of working with these established brands. That risk is only worth taking, or it's only justifiable if deep down you believe I am capable of producing a winning idea that these brands will like. And even if they don't like the first one, maybe they'll like the next one or the next one. But eventually there's something in me that is intrinsically good enough to produce something that eventually they will like. Otherwise, this risk makes no sense.
That's right.
So I'm curious, A, where do you feel like that, call it fundamental confidence, came from? And B, how do you try to coach or instill it in other people that sadly may lack it?
Well, I think it comes from two places. I think the first comes from, and it's certainly not your identity, but knowing yourself gives you confidence to sell your ideas. And if you don't know yourself, you might have a good idea and not know yourself. And that first principle of being original, that's a bad combination. So your identity, who you are, that's very important. Not that the idea is going to work, but it's foundational in how you apply that to selling your idea or to creating a company or being successful. So you have to really know who you are as a person and where you draw inspiration, what makes you unique, what your values are. You have to know all of that stuff.
Can we dig deeper into that? Because I think
sure.
that this whole idea of like know thyself, it sounds nice, but like in your words, what do you really mean when you say know yourself?
Well, I think when you know yourself, you really know how you want to live your life, what your values are, what your beliefs are, how you're going to interact with other people in the world around you. And then where you're coming from. What are the things that interest you? What are your interests? What do you love? What do you not love? What are stories that touch you? What music do you like? What entertainment do you like? What sparks you? What gets you excited? What are your idiosyncrasies? Where do you draw inspiration? It's all those elements put together that make you the person that you are. It makes you Jeff. It makes me Jason. It makes her Betty. It's going inward to really understand how to express that outwardly.
And you talked about, that's one of your values in your business is people bringing their whole selves to work. That's embodied in the weird value, right? Which I think a lot of knowing yourself, I think there's another level of knowing yourself, which is coming to terms with what you discover as you get to know yourself, making peace with it. Even, dare I say, learning to have agape love for yourself, not romantic love for yourself, which I think would be like narcissism, but agape empathy for those parts of yourself that you discover on that journey. So I'm curious if we can go even deeper with this. How did you get to know yourself in this way? And secondly, what do you think are the outward signs of a person that has done the work to know themselves?
Well, that's a really good question about the outward signs. But I really did it through personal growth, writing down stories, understanding my narrative, where I came from, how I was raised, what my blind spots are, what I need to work on.
Did you encounter some ugly messiness along the way?
Yeah, a ton. I've done tons of therapy. I mean, therapy is one really good way to. I'm
like the world's like biggest advocate for therapy. So you just made my day.
I mean, therapy is a critical component on sort of the expert level of getting to know yourself.
Yeah.
It's like the next rung up. But I did a lot of individual therapy. I've also done a lot of group therapy, and group therapy doesn't have to be, group therapy for drug addiction or survivors. It can be, certainly, but it can also be group therapy where you're talking once a week to a group of strangers and talking about things in your life. And that shows you, it's almost like research for yourself. It shows you how other people you don't know perceive you, how you come across, how you look to the outside world, that you might think you look a certain way when a group of strangers tells you how they feel when you're talking.
I did 2 years of group every week for 2 years straight. I'm so with you, man. It was probably even more developmentally essential than the individual therapy I did.
I think it is. I think it is more important. I mean, I think, I started with individual therapy and then moved to group therapy. And I did two different groups, and you really understand, all right, this is an area that I want to work on, or this is how I'm coming across where I don't want to come across that way. And so that was fundamental for me. But I don't think I believe in therapy. I believe in really going deep. it doesn't even have to be that far for people to start. I think they just really have to identify. There's so many people that don't even know the values that they want to live up to. They might have it in their mind, or they might think they know. I'm a big proponent in putting things to paper and writing them down and having a filter for how you want to go through life and having a life code. I think that's an important step. And then your other question of, I think it was the outward signs.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is really critical, by the way, when you're trying to hire into a culture,
Which part? Outward signs or?
Yeah. Being able to detect, having a sniff test for like, is this person really know themselves?
Yeah. I mean, I always ask, like, whenever I interview people, I obviously want to know if they're proficient and what their skills are and what's the best thing they worked on and how did they manage through a problem and all those things. But then I also ask, what would you, if you weren't doing this, what would you be doing?
Mm-hmm.
Who's someone in your life? Do you have a life mantra or motto that you live by? Do you have, I always ask questions outside of that to dig a little bit deeper on that aspect. But yeah, I forgot where we are.
Oh, it was, yeah. What do you feel like are the outward signs? And by the way, this is great. That's a good sign. It means we're going places. But yeah, what how do you size somebody up? Like, this person has gone deep with themselves and overcome their initial recoil to actually make peace with it and make friends with it so they can bring their whole selves into the work.
I want to hear someone tell me when they screwed up, what mistake they made, and are they vulnerable enough to share that? Mm-hmm. What went wrong? Where they screw up? Because so many interviews are everything's perfect and I'm the hardest worker and I'm the best person, because they're telling you what they think you want to hear, which is not what you want to hear. You want to hear that someone can be authentic and vulnerable. And I talk about, if I'm having a bad day, I'll talk about that with people that I work with. I used to lead, by the way, a lot of the stuff I had to learn, stuff I put in the book. I wasn't naturally a generous person. I was actually the opposite. I was a selfish, controlling person who,
that's cool. You can own that though.
Yeah. I didn't share my contacts with people. I wouldn't recommend other people.
Were you an only child by chance?
I was not. No, I wasn't.
Oh, I'm an only child. So that's how I excused it for a long time. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, I wasn't. I kind of thought business and life was like a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
Where, and I, had to realize that by broadening your network, by helping out other people, by being generous as a person, by giving people advice and counsel and helping other people out, that's where the success comes from. That puts you in another stratosphere, because you're widening your network and you're widening your influence and persuasion. And so I had to learn those skills. Those were not innate to me, there's certain principles that we talked about. People might already have those, but certain ones they're going to have to work at and practice so they become habits. And so, yeah, but back to your question on, I think we have really good bullshit detectors as people, and we know when somebody isn't being authentic and genuine. And when you ask hard questions, you want people to be vulnerable. You want to see really who they are. And when people are vulnerable and you're vulnerable, you're going to connect on a whole different level. And you're going to, just like this conversation, we're opening up all kinds of discussion points that if I just came on here and told you how amazing my company was and the book's incredible and I didn't have like a lot of learning to do and I didn't go to therapy, that's a stilted conversation that's not real. And it's the same way when you're looking at people that you want to partner with and clients you want to work with and people you want to hire.
Yeah, I think that, I actually had an Instagram reel just in the last few days that talked about vulnerability as an essential business skill, and how when the root word vulnus is the Latin word for wound, right? So vulnerability is the ability to be wounded. And that when you bring that into a group, you actually create safety, because you sort of imply to the group, I am making myself woundable here. Therefore, this must be a safe environment, right? And then you create that permission for other people to be vulnerable. But I think that a lot of times people sort of think of vulnerability as like there's a chicken and the egg question. Like, well, once I'm successful, then it'll be charming for me to also be vulnerable. It's like, oh, I never expected Steven Spielberg to let me see his inner child or something. But they're like, but I need to get successful first. Because if I allow myself to be woundable while I am also weak, then I'll just get squashed, right? And I want to call out that fallacy of people that think I'll be vulnerable when. What you're saying is that innate ability, or actually it's not innate. I don't think it's innate for anybody. That learned ability, that intentional developed ability to be vulnerable now is a precursor to the success that you might in your own mind think that you're waiting on as a precursor to being vulnerable.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. You need to develop it now.
Yeah.
You need to be vulnerable today, not when you're successful. That vulnerability will allow you to be successful. And when I was a leader in the company, I'm a much stronger leader now by being vulnerable and saying, this was a mistake. I screwed up. Hey, we're launching this thing. I'm not sure it's going to work. We're going to give it a shot. I'm taking a mental health day because I'm not feeling it today. You have to show other people by leading that way, and then they'll feel safe and comfortable in being the same. And then you're going to have employees and people and clients that are connected, more real, and your relationships are going to be stronger. One other thing I just wanted to kind of touch on is, to be successful, you got to know yourself, know your blind spots, know who you are, be yourself. We kind of covered that. Also, you have to be skilled at whatever you're building or offering.
Yes.
Like, you can't just start something because you feel like you know yourself and you're interested in this area, so you're going to start something. You have to really be proficient and put in the time to become an expert in that craft, and then put those two things together to be successful. But you can't kind of do that. There's not a shortcut to learning whatever craft there is or whatever you want to build. You don't have to know everything, and you don't have to know how to run a business, because no one that started a business knows how to run a business because they didn't do it before. Right. But you have to know your craft.
And there's no learning laboratory for running a business. It's like you literally can only learn it by doing it. It's like golf or something.
And if you're learning the skill you're selling and how to run a business at the same time, there's no way you can do that. You got to be comfortable with the skill, comfortable with yourself. Then you can be vulnerable to fail and succeed, and all the ups and downs of running a business.
When I started the social media content crusade that grew into Entre, the very first post I made on Instagram was one of, if not my all-time favorite quotes, which is by Jim Rohn, who said, basically, stop wishing it were easier, just wish you were better.
I love that. I love that quote.
And that's kind of what you're saying is like, if you get good enough, it'll work. Most things will work if you're good enough at them.
I agree.
100%. Jason, listen, man, I actually genuinely, deeply do not want to end this conversation, but unfortunately have to, because we've not only blasted through the 15-minute cushion I had before my next meeting, but now 7 minutes into that meeting. And I did send him a note saying, I'm having a great conversation. I'll be there when I can. But man, this has been a fantastic conversation. I like I said at the beginning, I feel like we're so aligned on so many things. Your success is not at all a surprise to me. And I appreciate you airing so much of it out for the audience here. This has been really wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
Are you willing to create slow evidence that it might possibly be true? I had zero evidence that I could become one of the best marketing coaches. Zero evidence, zero. But I'm like, am I willing to create and have slow evidence? And I'm going to say messy imperfection is really the way to go.